Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me for another bite-sized talk. This evening I'd like to introduce you to a really important group of artworks from the Worcester City collection. Donated by the Reverend George Downing Bowles in 1850, the collection contains some of the oldest artworks in our care, and I'd like to let you in on some of the exciting research and conservation work which has taken place within this collection over the last few months. I'm very grateful to the volunteers at Malvern Museum for pulling together research about the Reverend and his family, and I'd like to share some of their findings with you first of all. George Downing Bowles was born in 1789 and followed in his father's footsteps, studying at Oxford from 1808, before taking up the post of curate at Forley in Hampshire some time later. The research suggests that he was recommended for a curacy in Great Malvern a few years later still, and it was here that he married Anne Stillingfleet in 1818 at Great Malvern Priory. Anne's father owned 2 new houses in St Anne's Road, Great Malvern, one of which was the Shrubbery, which still stands today and you can see marked at the top of the map here. The birthplaces of their children suggest that George and Anne likely took up residence at the Shrubbery during the early 1830s. In 1850, George presented the Worcester Natural History Society with an autographed map of Honfleur, bearing the signature of King Louis Philippe. This was followed later in the same year by the donation of a collection of 26 historical portraits. 14 portraits were of British dignitaries and another 6 were of various compositions. This gift was reported in the Worcester Journal, which you can see an excerpt of here, and was clearly much appreciated by the President, Sir Charles Hastings. Whilst we're not sure how the paintings in question came into George Downing Bowles' possession, our friends at Malvern suggest that they may have been given as wedding presents or come to the couple through Anne's more affluent family circles. It must be after 1818 that the coat of arms was drawn onto the surface of each of the paintings given to the Worcester Natural History Society in 1850. The Bowles coat of arms consists of 3 standing bowls in gold, with 3 boars' heads in silver on a blue shield. The boars signify courage. These armorial bearings can be seen on the left-hand side of the crest of each painting. The Stillingfleet coat of arms, to the right of the crest, consists of 3 fleurs-de-lis and 3 possibly jaguar heads on a fess. The crest certainly seems to suggest a mark of joint ownership. George died in 1836, and Anne the following year. By 1871, the Shrubbery became home to his son, Charles Stillingfleet Bowles, and he and his family remained there for the rest of the century. At a time when Worcester's focus was primarily upon natural history, the Bowles donation represents the very beginnings of our interest in art and art history. Lost for decades during the war years, the portraits are a real hidden treasure of our collection, and last year we began to work on a dedicated exhibition in which we could display some of them for the first time in decades. The artworks include portraits of infamous historical figures including Henry VIII, Erasmus, and Mary Tudor. Our beautiful oil-on-panel portrait of Mary Queen of Scots is a particular favourite of visitors on our art store tours. You can see her here before conservation work began. The Lech Trust's grants programme supports projects in both the performing arts and conservation, and in October last year we were thrilled to be awarded funding which would enable the long-awaited conservation work to take place. Our conservator, Annabel Monaghan, began working on the portrait, removing the facing paper and the wax resin adhesive used to secure it in place. This facing paper was applied decades ago and would have served to consolidate any flaking or damaged areas of paint until further conservation work could take place. Annabel was then able to examine the paint surface more closely to establish its condition and the extent of any overpainting. She then worked to remove the varnish, a process which you can see in this clip, and which helps to return the artwork to its original condition and show the colours as intended by the artist. The portrait had been covered, as I said, with facing paper since at least the 1970s, and we really wanted to return her to a fit state and reunite her with her frame for the first time in living memory, ready for display. The Expert Eye programme, which is run by West Midlands Museum Development, has been running for 5 years now, supporting museums across the West Midlands region to improve their knowledge, expertise and confidence about the collections they hold. We were one of 4 museums awarded funding towards the end of 2020 and were lucky enough to receive our expert help from Gareth Williams, who is Curator and Head of Learning to the Western Park Foundation. Gareth was able to visit us in December and take a look at some of the paintings from the collection. He also visited Annabelle's studio, where he was able to see the Mary Queen of Scots portrait. He identified that it was originally painted as a portrait of an unknown high-ranking Netherlandish sitter. Gareth determined that the portrait emulates a miniature portrait by artist Isaac Oliver, which is in the Royal Collection, an image of which you can see in the right-hand corner here. This miniature was mistakenly identified as Mary Queen of Scots until the early 20th century. This image shows the portrait after Annabelle had removed half of the varnish. You can see what a difference it makes to the painting and how much brighter and clearer the colours are on the right-hand side of the subject. On the reverse of the portrait is an old ink inscription, which gives a provenance for the work. Although it is now difficult to read, Gareth was able to trace ownership of the artwork back to Alderman James Harmer of Ingres Abbey in Kent, which still stands and was built in around 1833 in a Tudor Gothic style and furnished in a similar taste. One theory is that the 19th century editions identified by Annabelle were added during this time, perhaps in order to complement the interior style of Ingres Abbey. Annabelle suspects that at least 2 earlier restoration attempts have been carried out on the artwork, both before and after these 19th century editions. This image shows her using a small scalpel and a microscope to remove the more insoluble areas of paint from the latter of these restoration attempts. Annabelle also identified that the sitter was originally holding a fan in her right hand on the left-hand side of the portrait here, another alteration which perhaps dates to the time of James Harmer. The fan she was holding went over the front of her hand. You can hopefully just about make out on the image here where the paint used to cover the fan has become transparent with age and changed colour. We have decided to leave this feature in place in order to better tell the history of the painting to future visitors. This image shows Annabelle working on a small split at the top of the panel. Before clamping the area, Annabelle has used a fish glue, which is natural, easily reversible and slow drying, which allows her more working time. This image shows how the panel has distorted to form this convex shape, which has meant we've been unable to display the portrait in its frame for such a long time. In the coming weeks, Annabelle will be working on the construction of a support, which will enable artwork and frame to be reunited ready for display. So I'd like to introduce you to another portrait from the collection briefly, and that is of Prince Rupert, or Rupert of the Rhine, as you may know him. Prince Rupert was a younger son of Elizabeth, the Winter Queen of Bohemia, and a nephew of King Charles I. He fought on land for his uncle throughout the Civil War, principally as a cavalry commander, and became Commander-in-Chief of the Royalist Land Forces in 1644. This half-length portrait depicts Prince Rupert in his Knight of the Garter robes and is derived from a full-length Lely portrait of the prince. Prince Rupert is thought to have sat only once to Lely for a head study that became the basis of subsequent portraits that were painted substantially by Lely's studio assistants. Gareth's research suggests that the prototype for the head in this portrait is almost certainly that in 2 3/4 length portraits of the prince, commissioned by the Duke of York, that which is now in the Royal Collection Trust, and by the Grand Duke of Tuscany, which is now in the Uffizi, Florence. You can learn more about Prince Rupert in the Commandery's Civil War Story exhibition. This looks at the last battle which was fought across Worcester, including at Fort Royal just behind the Commandery. We are hoping to open the Commandery site from Easter, so please do keep an eye on the website for more details about that. Unlike their predecessors, the Tudors ruled over a proliferation of painted portraiture. This period also saw portraiture move away from being the preserve of the monarchy and towards something which was commissioned by merchants, lawyers, writers and artisans. It could be seen in universities, in town halls and even in some domestic spaces. It's these portraits which give us a memorable sense of an individual's identity. We can recognise figures such as Henry VIII, whom you can see here in another of our Bowles collection portraits, in a way which we simply can't for earlier figures. In fact, during the Tudor period, artists and antiquarians tried to compensate for the absence of images of these earlier kings by constructing painted likenesses from illuminations and tomb sculptures. This was an age waking up to the power of image and the painted identity. Gareth was able to determine that this portrait of Henry VIII is based upon one which is formerly in the collection of the Earls of Warwick at Warwick Castle, a picture which was possibly acquired in 1801 by George Greville, 2nd Earl of Warwick, and was first recorded in the collection at Warwick Castle in 1815. I hope you've enjoyed this brief insight into the Bowles collection. There's so much more I could have shared with you at this stage. We are very much hoping to share more of Gareth and Annabelle's work with you in our Power of Portraiture exhibition at a rescheduled date. So please keep an eye out on our website and social media channels for updates about this. Those of you who are members will receive updates in your regular newsletters, of course, and for those wishing to do so, you can find details about how to become a member on our website. Thank you very much for joining me, and we'll look forward to welcoming you to our next bite-sized talk. Thank you.